In fact, Bob Kane had left Eisner and Iger and started his own studio. He had a handful of employees. Um, it was all kind of a joint venture with him as the face. In essence, he was producing material for comic books as well as his material, but it was his studio that did it. He did most of the artwork, but he also had some artists helping to pick up the slack. He also had writers, in particular, one individual named Bill Finger, who was also a recent graduate. Well, not recent. I guess he graduated in 1933. A graduate of DeWitt Clinton High School in the Bronx, also son of Jewish immigrants. Finger was an aspiring author who sometimes had to make ends meet however he could. Selling shoes was one of the things he was doing in the 1930s, and he was one of the writers of material that Kane presented as Bob Kane material. Now, before taking his Batman idea to national publications, Kane ran it by his writer, Bill Finger. And Finger made some recommendations. First of all, get rid of the bright colors. Perhaps this figure, since it's supposed to be a bat, should be a dark and mysterious figure of the night. So go with grays and blacks. Instead of actual wings, have a billowing cape. Instead of just a small domino mask, make it a cowl. And various other things that Finger recommended, so that the image was greatly revised from Kane's original idea. Finger wrote the story, and Kane drew it. It was, in fact, accepted by Detective Comics and appeared in Detective Comics number 27, May 1939. And Donenfeld and Leibowitz had their second mystery man, their second superhero. As you can see, the first couple of panels there introduce the secret identity of Batman and Commissioner Gordon, and you'll notice that it is by Robert Kane. Now, this is the deal that Kane apparently made, is that he signed over total ownership of the character to National in return for having his name as creator every time the character appeared. And the character started appearing a lot. Not quite as successful and popular as Superman, but almost. So that it became the regular headlining of the stories that was appearing in Detective Comics, and then later, of course, a second title called Batman. And as more Batman stories were called for, then Kane's studio stepped up, and he had several artists working on producing the material. So essentially, Bill Finger was continuing to write the stories, and he was getting his portion of the standard page count for producing the comics, whereas Bob Kane was getting all the credit and most of the money. In fact, even those stories that Kane didn't participate in at all, where he had other artists doing the drawing, he was still bringing in a couple of dollars a page. So he was bringing in the money, and because he was getting the credit, that was expanding the reputation of his studio, and therefore getting them, more accounts, more sales, and more money. Now, so far as who made which contribution, what it boils down to is that Bob Kane came up with the idea of something about a bat. Bill Finger took that made it a dark, mysterious figure of the night, wearing a cowl and a flowing cape, living in a place called Gotham City, having a secret identity, Bruce Wayne, who was a millionaire playboy whose parents had been murdered, and that had driven him to the desire to fight crime, having a friend named Commissioner Gordon, later having a kid sidekick named Robin, driving a car called the Batmobile, fighting people like the Joker and the Riddler. And Bob Kane became famous the world over as the creator of Batman. He became something of a celebrity in later years, and resisted any claim that anyone else had really participated, downplayed the role Bill Finger had played, even though it was pretty well an open secret in the industry that Bill Finger had been co-creator of Batman, the way that, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster were the co-creators of Superman. Finger managed to continue working in comics, but he never achieved any kind of lasting recognition or success. Eventually, finally, many years after his death, in 2014, DC Comics started having on the Batman comics co-created by Bob Kane and Bill Finger. And in 2016, the Batman vs. Superman movie, and also the Gotham TV series, had on the credits on the screen Bill Finger as co-creator. Again, decades after he had died, and without any really financial remuneration to him or to his family, really. So he got royally screwed over. Now, it is true that he was doing work for hire, but it was generally considered, even by other professionals in the industry, that the decent thing to have done would have been to list him as co-creator, again, like Siegel and Schuster had been presented. For me, one of the most poignant parts of this whole story came in the 1960s at the height of the popularity of the Batman TV show with Adam West. Now, this had brought Batman to whole new audiences and had led to a resurgence in interest in the characters, and a resurgence of Bob Kane's celebrity. He was all over the place in the 1960s. Bill Finger, meanwhile, had been scrounging around doing whatever freelance writing he could do to pay the bills, and he actually had a script, a teleplay, accepted for the Batman TV show, and he came on the set when they were filming, thinking that the people making the show knew who he was, but no one on the entire set, producers, directors, any of them, had ever heard of him or had any idea who he was or what connection he had with the stories they were telling. All right, now we're going to step back again for context. Bear with me. This is going to get a little convoluted and probably confusing, but even if you can't keep it all straight, it demonstrates sort of what the undercurrents were that were going on throughout this business, and it all kind of comes together. So let's start with Hugo Gernsback, who was a Jewish immigrant from Luxembourg, and initially a science fiction writer and later publisher. He is often referred to as the father of science fiction. He was the founder of the pulp science fiction magazine Amazing Stories, which we've talked about before. It was one of the most famous pulp magazines. It's the one where Anthony slash Buck Rogers first appeared. The first issue came out in 1926. Gernsback would helm several other science fiction pulp magazines, and he would be responsible for publishing many of the giants of the science fiction genre when they were just starting out. In fact, depending on how familiar you are with science fiction as a genre, the awards, the best science fiction awards that are given out each year are called the Hugo Awards, and they're named for Hugo Gernsback. All right, well, he was not in the comic book business. He was in the pulp fiction business. We're going to talk now about the company that he did business with, his distributor. Circulation and distribution, very important. So any kind of magazine venture, you've got the publishing, right, that puts it all together, but a publisher has to have a printer, a company to print what they are publishing, and then once they have it printed, they have to have a distributor to get them out to newsstands and get them out to stores. This is in the dinosaur-like days before the internet, when one person could do all that stuff. Well, the distribution company that Gernsback worked with closely was called the Eastern Distributing Company, and it was helmed by Paul Sampliner, a second-generation Jewish immigrant, son of Jewish immigrants. He's from Cleveland, like Siegel and Schuster. Paul Sampliner and his partner Warren Angel had started this distribution company in 1924. So initially, they took this company over and they were responsible for getting cigars, cigarettes, candy, and magazines to stores and newsstands. And the first big client that Sampliner got in 1924 was Frank Armour, guy in the hat there. Remember him, the girly magazine guy who had gotten his start with that Screen magazine, the Hollywood magazine. So Sampliner starts dealing with Armour, and then Armour later goes into the pulp girly magazine business, if you'll recall, and Sampliner was distributing those as well. Now, 1925, the year after the company was formed, Sampliner hired Louis Silberkleit, who was from New York City. He was he had a law degree and a training as a pharmacist, even though he was a young man at this time. Silberkleit eventually became head of circulation for the entire company. And in 1929, Silberkleit hired a promising young man, 21 years old, named Martin Goodman, to be his assistant. Martin Goodman's name had actually been Mo Goodman, but he changed it to Martin to be a little more Americanized, because Mo Goodman, like Paul Sampliner and like Louis Silberkleit, was the son of Jewish immigrants. All right, well, is this convoluted enough yet? If not, let's mix some more people in. Let's throw Harry Donenfeld in. Remember, he got involved with Armour and his girly magazines, and then when things kind of went south, he sort of sold Armour down the river and wound up acquiring his magazines. Remember that? Then, we've got Hugo Gernsback there. He's tied in here because he also was a big client. He was the big client that was gained by Louis Silberkleit. He got Gurns back in from the ground floor there when Amazing Stories first started. Well, everything's running fairly smoothly for all these guys until 1929, when the Great Depression hit. When the Great Depression hit, then a lot of publishers started to go under. A lot of printers started to go under, and eventually by 1933, Eastern Distributing Company declared bankruptcy. They went out of business. Now, before they had done that, the year before, 1932, Paul Sampliner had invested heavily in Harry Donenfeld and Donenfeld's company. So Sampliner and Donenfeld and Leibowitz were all close in there together. But with the collapse of the distribution company, Silberkleit and Goodman are going to be out of a job. Poor Hugo there, some of his magazines folded. Well, next question is, what are these promising younger guys? And you can't really tell how young they are. Actually, all these guys are around the same age, within a few years of one another. Anyway, Silberkleit and Goodman, what's going to happen to them? Well, they started their own publishing company and called it Newsstand Publications. It was a publisher of pulp fiction. But wait, you might be saying, we just talked about how it's the middle of the Great Depression and a lot of these pulp fiction titles are going under. Well, this was a slightly different approach. They were buying the rights to previously published Western stories. It was all reprints. Since it was reprints, they didn't have to pay as much. So, an author who maybe had the rights to one of his previously published stories, for which he might have gotten paid several cents per word when it was first published, for a reprint might only be able to get several fractions of 1 cent. But it's the Depression, and every little bit helps, and so a lot of people were willing to do that, which gave these guys really cheap material to rebundle and resell at full cover price and make a handy profit. Western Supernovel, 1933, May 33, was the first title they put out, and they expanded to several other Western titles. And they wound up publishing some of the early firmaments of the Western genre. Now, after a couple of years, these two guys went their separate ways. Silberkleit formed another company on his own, and Goodman kept charge of the first company. They also moved their offices. They had originally been located in the same Manhattan building where both Frank Armour and Hugo Gernsback were. Silberkleit formed a partnership with Maurice Coyne and John Goldwater. Maurice, Louis, and John, MLJ Magazines, it was called. Initially, they did pulp fiction, pulp magazines. Within a few years, they got in on the comic book bandwagon and would come up with some memorable characters in the early 1940s. By the late 1940s, they would introduce a character that is still well known today, and that would eventually lead to them changing the name of their whole company to Archie Comics. Martin Goodman, meanwhile, changed the name of his company back and forth several times. It was Red Circle for a while, but he continued producing pulp magazines in many different genres. One particular Western pulp that they put out was called The Black Rider, remarkably similar to the Lone Ranger. That one would stick in the mind of a young reader who followed the adventures of the Black Rider, a kid named Stanley Lieber, and the Black Rider will make a return eventually. Also, In 1936, there were a handful of issues of a jungle adventure pulp magazine called Kazar, about this, well, pretty much a Tarzan clone. This young boy who is orphaned and raised in the wilderness by a giant cat. Also, several science fiction pulp magazines, including, most notably, Marvel Science Stories. Now, in 1939, Martin Goodman was approached by some people representing a comic book syndication outfit called Funnies Incorporated that were trying to sell him on the idea of original comic book material. And they showed him some of the sales figures for Action Comics starring Superman. And of course, those sales figures were phenomenal. Goodman was particularly impressed, though, when he learned that comic book writers and artists are willing to work even more cheaply than pulp writers were, even pulp writers who were reprinting their stuff. So it didn't seem like that big of a risk to try putting out a comic book, because they were going to have to pay the talent so minimally that even if the magazine didn't do well, they'd probably still make a profit. So the writers and artists who worked for Funnies Incorporated were charged with coming up with some characters that Goodman would have final approval of. Goodman decided to use his pulp magazine, Marvel Science Stories, as a template for the title, and thus Marvel Comics #1 was released in October 1939, featuring the Human Torch, created by Carl Burgos, alias Max Finkelstein, who was the son of Jewish immigrants, and Prince Namor the Submariner, who, in perhaps one of the most unexpected and surprising turns of events of our class so far, was not the son of Jewish immigrants, and a comic book version of the pulp jungle character Kazar, as well as stories about a brightly garbed detective called the Angel and a masked cowboy called the Masked Raider. Goodman decided to use his pulp magazine, Marvel Science Stories, as a template for the title, and thus Marvel Comics #1 was released in October 1939, featuring the Human Torch, created by Carl Burgos, alias Max Finkelstein, who was the son of Jewish immigrants, and Prince Namor the Submariner, who, in perhaps one of the most unexpected and surprising turns of events of our class so far, was not the son of Jewish immigrants, and a comic book version of the pulp jungle character Kazar, as well as stories about a brightly garbed detective called the Angel and a masked cowboy called the Masked Raider. Goodman decided to use his pulp magazine, Marvel Science Stories, as a template for the title, and thus Marvel Comics #1 was released in October 1939, featuring the Human Torch, created by Carl Burgos, alias Max Finkelstein, who was the son of Jewish immigrants, and Prince Namor the Submariner, who, in perhaps one of the most unexpected and surprising turns of events of our class so far, was not the son of Jewish immigrants, and a comic book version of the pulp jungle character Khazar, as well as stories about a brightly garbed detective called the Angel and a masked cowboy called the Masked Raider. Goodman decided to use his pulp magazine, Marvel Science Stories, as a template for the title, and thus Marvel Comics number 1 was released in October 1939, featuring the Human Torch, created by Carl Burgos, alias Max Finkelstein, who was the son of Jewish immigrants, and Prince Namor the Submariner, who, in perhaps one of the most unexpected and surprising turns of events of our class so far, was not the son of Jewish immigrants, and a comic book version of the pulp jungle character Khazar, as well as stories about a brightly garbed detective called the Angel and a masked cowboy called the Masked Raider. And that was the birth of Marvel Comics, except it kind of wasn't, except it kind of was, except it kind of got complicated. The fact is, Martin Goodman had the habit of changing the name of his company fairly frequently, and not only that, he often had several different names at the same time. He had several shell companies, shell corporations, that were all doing the same thing, but under different names, and that was partly for tax purposes, and by purposes, I guess you could say obfuscation. But generally speaking, the pulp magazines that he was publishing in the 1930s came under the imprint of Red Circle, and this was their logo that they put on the covers when they remembered to put the logo on the covers. Once he branched out into the comic book business, though, in 1939, the logo, the imprint that was used on the various comic books was Timely. So if you look at histories of the comic book business, you will find that a frequently referenced thing, Timely Comics. Like, for example, the Human Torch was a character from Timely Comics, and that lasted through the 1940s. Then for much of the 1950s, it was Atlas, and that changed in 1957 for reasons we will go into later. Then Marvel Comics started to be used on many of the comics, and this was their logo that sporadically appeared from 1957 to 1961. Now, finally, in the summer of 1961, they started consistently calling all their books the same thing as far as publishers go. They had the same logo, and they were all published by Marvel Comics, and that was the beginning of Marvel Comics as we know them in its modern incarnation. That was June 1961, and the first new Marvel superhero showed up in November of that year, the Fantastic Four. So just to demonstrate how this worked and how complicated it could be, Captain America Comics, which was a Timely comic, was published by Complete Photo Story Corporation. Until several years later, all of a sudden it's being published by the Margine Magazine Corporation. The Submariner, a Timely comic, was initially published by Timely Comics until issue 8, when all of a sudden it was being published by Select Publications Incorporated. And by the end of the run of the Submariner in the early 50s, it was another publishing company. Marvel Mystery Comics, featuring the Human Torch, also initially published by Timely Comics until issue 55 in May of 1944, when all of a sudden it's being published by Marvel Comics Incorporated. So Marvel Comics Incorporated existed. It was one of the many different shell corporations that Goodman was using. But the name continued to pop up in the titles of his magazines. Remember, there was the Pulp Science Fiction magazine. That's the name he chose for his first comic book that was produced there with the help of Funnies Incorporated. And every once in a while, a timely comic like this issue of All Surprise from 1946 would be marked as being a Marvel magazine. So down through the years, all the names kept shifting and changing around, and there was a fair amount of consistency with logos, with Timely being in the 40s and Atlas in the 50s. But Marvel was always there in the background because Martin Goodman liked that word. It was a word that he thought was appealing to people. Some have speculated that the fact it had the same first syllable as his name may have had an effect as well on his positive attitudes toward the word. Anyway, as complicated as all this is, it is fair, I think, to simplify things somewhat and refer to all this stuff from 1939 on as early Marvel, or as Marvel, with the understanding that you're actually talking about Timely until you're talking about Atlas, until you're talking about Marvel. Goodman had ordered an initial print run of 80,000 copies for Marvel Comics #1, and they sold out quickly. So they went into a second printing, which eventually sold 800,000 copies. Now, that's what I'm talking about, no doubt. Goodman thought to himself, because that's just the kind of numbers he was dreaming of. So he decided to change gears and shift over to comic books, away from pulp magazines, as a more lucrative endeavor, and decided to have his own in-house staff working on these comics. So the first hire that he made was from Funnies Incorporated, Joe Simon, who had been born Jaime Simon in New York. He was a writer and an artist. So he was the first employee of Timely Comics. Shortly afterward, he brought his friend and colleague over from Funnies Incorporated, Jack Kirby, an artist who was born Jacob Kurtzberg, and shortly afterward, a third employee came over from the same outfit, Sid Shores, an inker. So they've got a writer, an artist, and an inker. So they're ready to go. The golden age of comics had begun.